Hello, and welcome to the virtual companion series for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, A History by Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson. This video covers Chapter 4, A Denomination in the Diaspora, 1880 to 1916. I am Dr. Christina Dickerson-Cousin, and in this video I will be providing you with historical context to help guide your understanding of Chapter 4. The topics for this video include the rise of Jim Crow, Washington and Du Bois, and the scramble for Africa. Most of you are familiar with the term Jim Crow, but where does the term Jim Crow come from? Actually, Jim Crow was a popular minstrel show character who was invented by a white man. And this white man portrayed Jim Crow while wearing blackface. The system of Jim Crow arises out of the ashes of Reconstruction. So after Reconstruction fails in 1877, Southern states begin passing laws to legally separate whites and blacks. In 1890, for example, Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, which was a railway segregation law. African Americans pushed back. In 1892, Homer Plessy, an African American, purchased a train ticket in Louisiana. The train conductor told him to go to the segregated car for African Americans. Plessy expected this to happen. He refused and was arrested. He brought his case to court, and it eventually made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. Plessy argued that his 14th Amendment rights had been violated. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in the landmark Plessy v. Ferguson case. The court decided that separate but equal accommodations were constitutional. The Plessy v. Ferguson case emboldened Southern states to pass their own segregation laws, since they knew that the Supreme Court would uphold them. So by the early 1900s, legalized segregation was ubiquitous throughout the South. And if you look on the map here, you can see various dates in red. And these dates represent when Jim Crow railroad car laws were passed, so when the railroad cars were legally segregated. And so you can see that process continuing throughout the South, particularly after that 1896 ruling. So after the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case, Jim Crow segregation really became the law of the land in the South. And it affected all aspects of life. There were not only segregated railway cars, but segregated schools, stores, restaurants, and various public accommodations. And it wasn't only that accommodations and restaurants were segregated. In addition to that, blacks were expected to always behave in a subservient manner to all whites. So for example, if you are walking on the sidewalk and you're a black person and a white person is coming towards you, you have to surrender the sidewalk, get off the sidewalk and let the white person pass. If you're a black man, you had to take off your hat and bow your head to a white person. Blacks had to always call whites Mr., Miss, or Mrs., whereas whites could call them boy, girl, uncle, and auntie. Failure to comply with these unspoken rules could lead to deadly consequences for African Americans. During Jim Crow, Southern whites constantly assaulted black men's voting rights. We talked about in the previous video how during Reconstruction, black men had record political participation. After Reconstruction ends and Jim Crow becomes the law of the land in the South, they try to roll back these voting rights. So for example, they used means like straight up violence and intimidation, but also they moved polling places, destroyed ballots, and forced black people to pay poll taxes. You can see a few examples of that here. So literally having to pay a tax in order to vote. And black people were also forced to pass literacy tests. And the literacy tests were often outrageous. So, can you read this entire portion of the Constitution and explain exactly what it means to my satisfaction? And so, of course, African Americans were denied the right to vote because they often could not pay these poll taxes and could not pass these ridiculous literacy tests. Just as the Supreme Court upheld segregation in 1896, the Supreme Court also supported the passing of poll taxes and literacy tests. So in the 1898 Supreme Court decision in Williams versus Mississippi, the Supreme Court said that poll taxes, literacy tests, and understanding clauses in Mississippi were constitutional. Southern states again took their cue from the Supreme Court and continued to pass voting laws that disenfranchised African Americans. So you can see on the map here, the dates in black show the date of black disenfranchisement in these various southern states. White supremacists used violence to maintain the Jim Crow system. So violence, fear, intimidation. One way that they did this was through lynchings. Lynchings became prominent in the South, and African Americans were forced to constantly live in fear, and they very rarely, if ever, received support from local police, sheriffs, the state, anyone. Ida B. Wells became an outspoken activist against lynching, and in 1895, she documented this horrific practice in a red record. And so this was highly significant because prior to her, there was no comprehensive examination of how many lynchings there were there more lynchings in one state versus another. So her work really brought lynching to the fore, and she had to run for her life because of her activism. The Jim Crow system existed in the South from the 1880s to the 1960s. So it was not until the Civil Rights Movement that the Jim Crow system finally ended. Booker T. Washington was one of the most influential black leaders during the Jim Crow era. He was born in 1856 in Virginia. His mother was an enslaved woman. His father was an unknown white man. Throughout his youth, he nurtured a deep desire to learn to read and obtain an education. So finally, when freedom does come, he walked 500 miles to enroll in Hampton Institute in Virginia. Washington becomes a teacher and eventually takes charge at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He established a vocational curriculum there, emphasizing trade work. Northern philanthropists like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and others financially supported Tuskegee. They believed in Washington's vision of training African Americans for vocational work. In 1895, Booker T. Washington delivered his most famous speech. It was at the Cotton States Exposition in Atlanta, and this speech became known as the Atlanta Compromise speech. In the speech, Washington implored both whites and blacks to, quote, cast down your bucket where you are. By this, he's telling whites, you don't need to look to foreign immigrants to work for you. Rather, you can rely on the labor of African Americans who have long since been working for you in your homes and in your fields. To blacks, he's saying, again, cast down your bucket where you are. Don't rush off to the north and seek new jobs and opportunities. Rather, stay in the South where you are home and where you will have economic opportunities in the future. He reassured whites in this speech that blacks were content to remain in servile positions, and this was something that white people very much wanted to hear. given the upheavals of the Civil War and Reconstruction, they wanted to hear that African Americans would be happy to be in these servile positions. Washington encouraged blacks to halt their fight for civil rights and contended that in all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. So he's signaling here that African Americans are not looking for civil rights. We are not looking for integration. In all things purely social, we can be apart. We can have our own clubs, our own places that we frequent. But in things that are involving economics, we can work together. Throughout his career, Washington continued to encourage blacks to focus on vocational education and vocational jobs. He made this argument poignantly in his autobiography, Up from Slavery. Black leaders like William Monroe Trotter and Reverdy C. Ransom opposed Washington's approach. They did not like the idea of foregoing civil rights, foregoing, looking for more economic advancement beyond vocational occupations. Trotter was a newspaper editor and businessman, and Ransom was an influential AME minister and future AME bishop. W.E.B. Du Bois became Washington's most prominent critic. Du Bois was born in Massachusetts. He graduated from Fisk University, where he engaged in a liberal arts education, and he earned a PhD from Harvard University in 1895. And then afterwards, he taught at Atlanta University. He spoke out against Jim Crow and advocated for black civil rights, so he was very much opposed to Washington's accommodationism. Du Bois attacked Washington in The Souls of Black Folk. Unlike Washington, Du Bois argued that blacks should pursue liberal arts education. They should seek to become doctors and lawyers, not only farmers and carpenters. Washington wasn't saying that black people were unable to do those things. He just believed that at the present time, Southern blacks should focus on that vocational education and vocational work. But Du Bois is saying, no, we can do that now. We can seek out liberal arts education now and go as far as our talents will lead us. In 1905, Du Bois and Trotter created the Niagara Movement, which was a civil rights group that protested Jim Crow and demanded equal rights for black people. And this Niagara Movement was very popular among black intellectuals and professionals. Reverdy Ransom joined, and so did Ida B. Wells. Members of the Niagara Movement advocated for persistent agitation to achieve their goals. The Niagara Movement, however, struggled because of weak finances and infighting. So, after several years, like-minded blacks and whites decided that they needed to create a new interracial organization to continue the work of the fledgling Niagara Movement. That organization became the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, which was founded in 1909. The NAACP, of course, continues to exist today, and it took a leading role in the fight against Jim Crow segregation. Both Washington and Du Bois played critical roles in the fight for African American advancement during this period. Washington died in 1915. Du Bois lived into the 1960s. So we have looked at how the Jim Crow system came to be during this period, and we've seen how Washington and Du Bois had different visions for how to enable African Americans to advance. So as African Americans are facing violence and discrimination and seeking to gain better lives for themselves, Africans on the continent are enduring a painful period of European imperialism. Through imperialism, European nations wanted to obtain control over Africa's vast national resources, and they felt that doing so would allow them to gain both economic and political power. Africa was and is richly diverse, many ethnic groups, many languages, many different forms of government. Africa was and is rich in natural resources as well, and Europeans wanted access to and control over them. So you can see on this map here the different regions of Africa and what they were rich in. So oil, gas, coal, copper, gold, diamonds, etc. In 1884, 14 European nations attended the Berlin Conference. So you can see the 14 nations listed here. So France, Germany, Great Britain, Belgium, Austria-Hungary, etc. The United States also attended. During this meeting, these European and American nations decided who was going to control different regions of Africa. So it's a pretty, galling thing to do for these European nations to have a meeting, not consult any indigenous Africans, and just decide which nation was going to have access to what part of Africa. So the goal for them was to eliminate confusion and conflict among them so that they're not fighting with each other over which African region they're going to control. So as a result of this meeting, Europeans carved up Africa and set about subduing its people and extracting its resources. And you can see how it was divided up on this map here. So you see the French in green, the British in red, the Belgians in purple, and so on. And this process of colonization continued well into the 20th century. So also during this period, this scramble for Africa period, the Dutch and the British were both fighting over land in South Africa. South Africans like the Xhosa and Zulu fought to protect their land and their people. In 1910, the British established the Union of South Africa, which included several different regions. And several of these regions had once been Dutch republics. A few decades later, the British instituted apartheid, which was a system of legalized racial segregation that oppressed Black South Africans.